Good morning, and welcome to the latest episode of the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and this interview is part of the Europe Center's Transatlantic Horizon series, which seeks to outline a productive relationship for the United States and Europe for 2025 and beyond. My guest today is Mr. Dan Vajdich, President of Yorktown Solutions and former Republican campaign advisor. Dan, welcome to the show, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
So, as a follow-up to a debrief that we hosted last year with longtime Democratic campaign operative Ian Russell, I wanted to pick up on elements of that conversation talking about the U.S. elections and the implications for the transatlantic relationship now from a Republican perspective. Just yesterday, Super Tuesday, voters across 16 states cast their primary ballots, with former President Trump outperforming Republican candidate Nikki Haley. We're recording this episode on Wednesday the 6th. And it seems as though Ambassador Haley is going to drop out of the race today if she hasn't already. And it's even more clear that a rematch of the 2020 presidential election is going to be in store for 2024. So I want to jump right in and discuss these dynamics and trends in U.S. politics, as well as the future of transatlantic relations and whether you see U.S.-European relations on the proverbial chopping block. So to sort of get started, Americans don't usually vote on foreign policy. This is something that's been well known for a long time. But it seems as though over past recent election cycles that we are seeing a deepening confluence of domestic campaign messaging and foreign policy messaging. Is that something that you're seeing on the Republican side as well?
There's no doubt about that. I mean, I think, while we're focusing on the Republican side, I do think it's happening on both sides in slightly different ways. But you're absolutely right, Rachel. I mean, traditionally, foreign policy is not something that Americans really vote on the basis of. And there is a little bit of an intensification that we can point to. But when you look at, the polls, they will say that roughly 2% of Americans see foreign policy is the top issue that they're voting on the basis of, which is to be expected. I mean, I think that's true, in a lot of countries that aren't, directly engaged in, conflict that average citizens can feel and things of that nature. But you do have, 4 in 10 roughly Americans saying foreign policy is a top 5 issue. Within that, though, it's complicated. They're not saying, foreign policy is an issue or should be more of an issue because we necessarily need more U.S. engagement with the world, including Europe. Half of those Americans are saying actually, in fact, the opposite. We want to see less engagement. We want to see disengagement. Why are we involved here? Why are we involved there? And that includes Europe as well. That's sort of the quintessential example, quite frankly, that a lot of Americans use in terms of, involvement abroad, the stationing of American troops abroad. This is definitely an issue and an example that's raised in that context very often. And you're absolutely right that there has been a confluence of domestic and foreign issues, foreign policy matters. Largely on the Republican side, but not just on the Republican side. And I know you've talked to Democratic strategists, as you've talked about before, mentioned, who have referenced maybe some of this as well. But, the two examples are the two examples of issues and events that are currently taking place in the world right now that are most relevant, most visible. That's Ukraine and that's Israel and Gaza. So with Ukraine, we see a very, very clear confluence with respect to, a lot of Republican, average Republicans and therefore, their elected members on Capitol Hill saying, well, why are we spending all this money to secure the Ukrainian border when we haven't secured our own? And there has been some pushback to say, of course, well, how exactly are these two things related? Or, one does not necessarily prevent the other. But it's a very good example, perhaps the best example of this confluence. It's also happening with respect to Israel and Gaza, no doubt about it. Republicans have passed or tried to pass a couple, Israel-only spending bills, assistance bills, because of evangelical support for Israel among Republicans. But the first time that they passed it in the House, they passed an Israel-only security assistance bill, so without Ukraine and Taiwan, and they coupled this with offsets for the IRS, meaning that they would fund this by sort of defunding components of the IRS. And so even there, I mean, with an issue that on the right, Israel, where there's been a lot of consensus, it was politicized. And it was politicized in a domestic context. And we see that ongoing process happening. On the left, and again, I know that I'm supposed to be focusing on Republicans and conservatives,
it's okay.
But on the left, it's also become a huge issue, Israel and Gaza. I don't see an electoral map for President Biden's victory without Michigan. In Michigan, you have a very large Arab American, Muslim American population. Anyone who tells me that the administration is not thinking about them and those votes in the context of Israel and Gaza and how they approach that, I'm just going to tell them that they're delusional or that they're posturing because this is what they're paid to do. It definitely. I mean, this is an example of convergence on the left. So it's without a doubt, this is a phenomenon that's been happening and is happening in a more intense way today than it ever has in I would say decades.
Yeah. Well, it also seems like, there is sort of a divergence between the left and the right, but it also seems like there's a divergence within the Republican Party in terms of what the U.S. role should be in the world. And I think putting different Republican factions into like internationalist and isolationist camps is a little bit too simplistic. I think it goes a lot deeper than that. But I'm curious, we're hosting this Atlantic Debrief as part of the Europe Center. So I'm curious as to how you think Europe is going to play into those different factions as the 2024 election progresses. Like, do you think that NATO and the EU are going to become, if they're not already targets, like higher targets for certain candidates, both presidential and for down ballot races as well? And how do you sort of see that playing out over the coming months?
Again, absolutely right, Rachel, when you say that, there are factions within the Republican Party, but even those factions are not a monolith. And it's really, really complex. And so you do have, what you could consider the sort of traditional isolationists who are pretty, whether you agree or disagree, pretty consistent and pretty principled when it comes to their positions and what they're voting for or against on Capitol Hill. And that, of course, is, sort of the Freedom Caucus crowd on Capitol Hill in the House, the America First crowd, as they would probably describe themselves. But then you have a lot of Republicans, but even a majority of Republicans who are not isolationists, who fundamentally believe in the transatlantic relationship and believe in the U.S. alliance system. However, a lot of these Republicans are, again, rightly or wrongly disappointed when it comes to Europe, especially when it comes to NATO. And they're, they are, some of them often, or sometimes, as we see with recent voting on, say, the National Security Supplemental in the Senate, occasionally will bandwagon with the isolationist, even though they themselves are not isolationists. And that's a reflection of both sort of, the bottom-up politics of today that they are facing in their districts and in their states. But it's also reflective of a genuine disappointment. And again, I say justified or unjustified because a lot of people will say, well, look, the Europeans, defense spending is increasing. Look, what they're doing in terms of Ukraine right now at a time when we're not able to get a supplemental through. But still, this is not a snapshot in time, or it shouldn't be. This disappointment has been developing, evolving for years. And now it's kind of, to use your word, Rachel, there's been a convergence, or it's converged with sort of domestic politics. And so, going back to one of your other questions, are European institutions or transatlantic institutions going to become a little bit of a punching bag? Look, I'd say with respect to the EU, not so much. It's not tangible enough. Americans don't understand it, quite frankly, for it to be relevant, quite frankly, as a punching bag. NATO definitely. And one of the things that I think you will see is Republicans, questioning NATO, not just in terms of its spending, but also its, what we used to call out-of-area operations, during Afghanistan. What is the relevance of NATO beyond Europe? And there, a lot of Republicans are focused on China. And this was definitely, a trend that was taking place before Trump, but, during Trump's first term, it was, amplified, 1,000-fold. And it's really, really intensified. And so, they're looking for a China component to a lot of, different sort of foreign policy activities. And, if they don't see it, they're going to see an opening there to criticize those institutions.
Okay. It seems as though we've gotten to a point, and I talk about this with Europeans as well. Like, it seems as though the Democrats are seen as like the saviors of the transatlantic relationship. And to me, it really shouldn't matter who's in office, whether Republicans or Democrats. Both parties have been critical of our NATO allies for decades when it comes to not spending enough on defense, not shouldering enough of the defense burden. And so it seems to me we've gotten to this point where when you talk to Europeans, they are holding their breath, hoping for not another second term of the Trump administration, because they sort of see the Republican Party now as a threat to the transatlantic relationship, whereas the Democrats are seen as sort of the more coddling towards it. And it seems as though that's sort of, I don't think that's how it should be. Like, it shouldn't matter necessarily who's in the White House, I guess.
I agree, Rachel. It shouldn't, but I also agree that to a large extent, it does. And whether President Biden wins or President Trump wins is going to make a big difference. This is not Obama-Romney, where, quite frankly, it would have made no difference virtually, with respect to the transatlantic relationship, at least. And so, Europeans, I think are quiet now, and it's that is the smart thing to do. But I go back to what do Republicans, many Republicans, but especially President Trump, and in part, driven by President Trump, want out of the transatlantic relationship. They do want it to be relevant. They want it to be useful. They just want it to be useful and relevant with respect to the issues that they feel are most important to the United States. And there I go back to China, and what I've been hearing is that President Trump, one of the things that he will seek formally if he wins again and re-enters the White House is to reconfigure NATO in some sort of formal way, some sort of statutory way, to focus on China. And if if there is not a corresponding willingness within NATO and NATO member states to do that, that he may pursue a withdrawal process. That's very real. But there's a way to prevent that. I think I go back to what Europeans are doing now is being pretty smart and being quiet, and not being involved in the U.S. Electoral process when maybe their emotions would lead them to speak up one way or another. But there's a way. I think under a second presidency of Donald Trump to give him a little bit of what he's looking for with respect to some of these institutions, primarily NATO, while preserving. I speak from perspective of European countries, while preserving their interests and their principles, and preserving the transatlantic relationship the way that they view it for future generations. And that's not easy, but they need to think in this sort of long-term way because it's not easy, but it's possible. It's possible. They need to be smart and composed, and understand that everything with Donald Trump is a negotiation. And this is one that I think, where they can get to yes, they can preserve the institutions. Maybe they can be slightly reoriented in a formal or informal way to give, a Trump administration what it's looking for in that context. But again, while preserving the transatlantic relationship as they view it for future generations, I really think that, and I hope that that's the way that European countries would think of the United States and sort of act under a second Trump presidency.
Yeah. We're sort of out of time, but I want to just pick up on one of these threads that you talked about, the sort of like reorientation potentially of NATO under a second Trump term towards China. Doesn't that sort of fundamentally go against what NATO's main purpose is, which is to protect the European continent? I mean, it seems to me that if there was a second Trump term and there were thoughts about reorienting NATO, it should be much more focus on Russia and Europe's general neighborhood. It seems sort of bizarre to try to fundamentally reorient NATO or China.
That's more than a fair question, Rachel. I mean, especially at a time when, we are seeing the most tangible form of Russian aggression, the invasion of neighboring countries. Wouldn't reorienting NATO away from that sort of dilute its ability to counter those threats in the theater that it was intended, which is Europe. Look, I think that's again a fair argument to make, but it's not one that's going to resonate with Donald Trump or his administration. And so the way the Europeans need to be thinking about this is, how do we preserve NATO and its fundamental orientation towards Europe and perhaps Eurasia, while providing a Trump administration with some aspect to NATO that would allow them to see it as relevant according to their definition of relevance. And I think that's really important because without that, I don't know that NATO can be preserved. And I don't want to be dramatic. But I think that we're going to enter some very turbulent waters on this front under a second Trump administration. And, the Europeans, have a responsibility to themselves and to these institutions that they care about, if they really care about them. I mean, if they really want to preserve NATO, ironically, they will work with Donald Trump and the Trump administration to reorient it in a way that's acceptable, but not fundamental to Europe and their interests. And that's the way that they need to think about all of this.
This was super helpful and gave us some good insight into how the Republican Party's thinking about Europe at the moment, especially under a potential second Trump term. As I said at the beginning, it's looking like we'll have, and it's looked for a while that we're going to have a Trump-Biden rematch for 2024. And so we will likely continue these conversations as the election goes on, as we get closer to November. So with that, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. And I look forward to having another one of these conversations in the coming months.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Rachel.